the first polygonal zombie shuffled onto our screens, Resident Evil has been a hit favourite of gamers across the world. Debuting on original PlayStation in 1996, the Resident Evil series' unique brand of horror B-movie cheese, creepy locations and resource management was eventually defined as the survival horror genre, and spun off into multiple sequels, side stories and remakes. You might say it's enjoyed complete global saturation. After 11 main entries, over a dozen spin-offs and 2 remakes with a third on the way, it can be a little time consuming to find out which are worth playing, and which, well, aren't. To help separate the meat from the shaft, or rather the juicy delicious brains from the splattered skull fragments, we've put together a power ranking of the best 4 ever Resident Evil games to get you started. Now before you start calling for our heads to be chainsawed off in the comments for not including your favourite, bear in mind we're trying to include the absolute essentials. In a series as varied and long-running as Resident Evil, it's a tough choice to crush as many of the great entries in the same series down to a list of 4. With that disclaimer out of the way, here are 4 best ever Resident Evil games. Number 4, Resident Evil Remake. Some might say we're starting with a showstopper, and we might be inclined to agree. Originally released in 2002 for the Nintendo GameCube, this remake of the original Resident Evil is arguably an example of the series at its very best. While the original Resident Evil on PlayStation 1996 was considered a creepy horror pastiche, it quickly aged into something far cheesier, with its laughable voice acting and poor Japanese to English translation robbing it of its intended tone and impact.
Stop it! Don't open that door!
The Resident Evil remake rectifies this with its far more moodier and sober atmosphere that really makes you feel like you're fighting for your life through the corridors of a lonely abandoned mansion. From a gameplay perspective, it's also the series at its purest, with a heavy emphasis on cautious exploration, brain-teasing puzzles and knowing when to conserve your precious ammo and flee from a fight. Numerous improvements on the original, such as the vicious Crimson Heads and the unkillable Lisa Trevor, flesh out both the backstory and the game mechanics into a much more complete package than we received in 1996. And in all honesty, we think the Resident Evil remake stands the test of time much better than the PlayStation original. After all, they haven't had to remake it again, right? Number 3, Resident Evil 7. 7 higher than the Resident Evil remake? Sacrilege, I hear you cry. Yes, well, we dared to do it. Here's why. While the Resident Evil remake is a near perfect example of the classic Resident Evil formula, Resident Evil 7 was a much needed reinvigoration of this.
While it might be kicking the hornet's nest to acknowledge this, Resident Evil had lost its way as a series in the last few entries, and was straying so far away from its roots it was becoming unrecognisable. There had been a few attempts to reel it back in, such as Resident Evil Revelations, but Resident Evil 7 was a true return to form. Puzzles, item management and even a creepy gothic mansion were back, but where Resident Evil 7 shone was in its twist to the formula as being the first mainline game in the series to be in first person. This provided Resident Evil with a literal new perspective, a third pillar to the fixed camera angles of the classic series and the over-the-shoulder view of later entries. Better yet, this entry was also built with virtual reality headsets in mind, providing one of the best and scariest experiences with this fledgling technology. Apart from this, Resident Evil 7 also continued the series tradition of blending terrifying bioterrorist incidents with heaps of ridiculous cheese on top, this time taking on a distinctly more southern fried flavour as it takes place in Bayou, somewhere in the American Deep South. For its dedication to its history but also taking steps into its future, Resident Evil 7 is a very worthy addition to this list.
Welcome to the family, son.
Number 2, Resident Evil 4. No list of the best Resident Evil games would be complete without this one. After years of waiting, including numerous scrap versions of development, Resident Evil 4 was finally released in 2005 on the Nintendo GameCube, and it was absolutely worth the wait. In many ways, Resident Evil was a victim of its own success. Critical praise and good sales led to the series very quickly expanding beyond its initial entry with sequel after sequel. And while the quality generally held up, the classic formula was eventually becoming long in the tooth, with players demanding much needed change. Resident Evil 4 was a pivot to a more action-oriented type of survival horror, with returning Resident Evil 2 protagonist Leon S. Kennedy facing wave after wave of parasite-infected, murderous villagers in an unnamed part of rural Spain, a much more agile and aggressive enemy than the shambling zombies he'd faced in Raccoon City. Two key alterations facilitated this change: a brand new over-the-shoulder camera that made shooting these more athletic enemies easier than ever, and access to far more available ammo and offensive weaponry than in previous entry. Despite these changes, it was still Resident Evil at heart. Item puzzles, camp villains, and a creepy cultist's castle made us feel right at home, despite these fundamental differences in how the game would play. And perhaps for that reason, it is easily one of the more fondly remembered entries in the series. Although the immediate sequels that followed would replicate this formula to a T, there's just something about Resident Evil 4 that makes it stand head and shoulders above the rest, for its originality and bravery to shake things up. Number 1. Resident Evil 2 and Resident Evil 2 Remake. Yes, it's unorthodox for a joint number 1 placement, but you literally can't have one without the other in this case, so allow us to bend the rules just a little this once. Resident Evil 2 is the ultimate fan favourite of the series. 4 does give it a good run for its money, but when the chips are down, the fan base has shown time and time again it holds the most affection for the sequel to the PlayStation original. Where the first Resident Evil was a hit with players, Resident Evil 2 was a cultural touchstone of the developing gaming culture shown through its brief appearance in the sitcom Spaced, and developer Capcom hiring zombie movie legend George A. Romero to direct a live-action advert for the release. Resident Evil took every part that the original players loved and made them bigger and better, buffing off the rough edges that undermined the experience and transplanting the action deep into the heart of the collapsing Raccoon City in the wake of a mass zombie outbreak. The characters were cooler, the atmosphere was creepier, and the game was just plain better. Not only that, but you effectively had twice the game for your money, as the famous hook of Resident Evil 2 was in the Scenario A and Scenario B gimmick. Much like in the original game, you had a choice of 2 protagonists with somewhat different experiences, but in Resident Evil 2, this was built out into a fully fledged system where playable characters Leon S. Kennedy and Claire Redfield had individual campaigns that occurred concurrently, meaning once the credits rolled for the first time, you still effectively had a completely separate second half of the game to explore with whichever character you didn't pick for Scenario A.
Resident Evil 2.
Certain actions taken in Scenario A would also impact Scenario B through something called the zapping system. Although limited, this was incredibly forward-thinking for a game released in 1998. Skipping along a few years, when fans learned the original Resident Evil was being remade back in the early 2000s, the first question on their lips was, when are you remaking Resident Evil 2? It took a lot longer to happen, but in early 2019, the remake of Resident Evil 2 launched, after development was announced 3.5 years earlier. Although changes were expected even in this relatively faithful remake, where the Resident Evil 2 truly succeeded was finally being able to marry the classic formula with the better aiming and shooting controls that had been introduced since Resident Evil 4. Some of the previous titles had attempted this feature, but were unable to recapture the true feeling of survival horror in quite the same way. Where Resident Evil 2 triumphs is in bringing back the oppressive feeling of dwindling resources and ammunition against enemies that just won't stay dead. The better aiming ensures even the worst shot can put a bullet into a zombie easily enough, but what good is that against an undead enemy that doesn't feel pain and won't go down without taking one to the head? One wrong move against a particularly twitchy zombie closing the distance between you, and you might end up a flesh buffet. That's not to exclude the near omnipresent Mr. X, who will unyieldingly chase you from room to room at certain points of the game. Blah. Although Mr. X appeared in Scenario B of the original Resident Evil 2 as a reoccurring enemy, it wasn't nearly as sophisticated as his implementation in the remake, and we mean that literally. I mean, for an 8-foot tall genetic experiment gone wrong, you can't fault his fashion sense. While there are countless reasons to love the Resident Evil 2 remake, there are some omissions that longtime fans lament. For this reason, despite an absolutely stellar game, the remake cannot replace the original in the same way it did for the first game, and precisely why both versions of Resident Evil 2 occupy the top slot of this list.